I had just placed one foot onto the boarding walkway when the flight attendant leaned close and whispered in my ear, her voice trembling, "Please, pretend you're sick and get off the plane right now." I froze. My son and daughter-in-law were already seated 3 rows ahead, boarding passes scanned, carry-on bags neatly stowed. A family trip to California, the gift they said was meant to bring us closer together. Before I could react, the flight attendant turned back, her eyes red and glassy. "Don't ask questions, if you still want to live." My heart began to pound, not because of illness, but because I knew something had gone far beyond an ordinary vacation. If you're still here, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Every comment helps this story reach more hearts. And if it moved you, give it a like so others can find it too. I stood frozen in the narrow aisle leading into the cabin, my hand gripping the strap of the worn leather bag I'd carried for over 10 years. The familiar smell of metal, cold air conditioning, and faint disinfectant, the smell of thousands of flights, of people coming and going, suddenly felt suffocating. I looked ahead. Daniel was bent over his phone, Vanessa sitting beside him, back straight, makeup just right, her face as composed and cold as always. They didn't turn around. Not a glance to look for me, not a single gesture of waiting. My name is Arthur Reynolds. I am 68 years old. I used to teach sociology at a public high school in Orlando, Florida. Nearly 40 years in the classroom trained me to observe people through the smallest details. The way a student avoids eye contact when lying, the way a parent smiles a little too much when hiding something. I retired 3 years ago after a long bout of back pain and late nights grading papers that made my eyesight fade faster than I expected. The 2-story suburban house, the one I bought when Daniel was still in elementary school, was no longer a place where I lived alone. Daniel and Vanessa moved in with me 8 months ago. Daniel said his company was restructuring and he needed time to figure out his next step. Vanessa said it was a chance for the family to be closer. I nodded. I had always nodded when it came to my son, but from the day they moved in, the house grew quiet in a different way. Not the peaceful quiet of old age, but a deliberate silence. We greeted each other each morning, exchanged only necessary words about dinner or utility bills. No long conversations, no laughter. Then, 2 weeks ago, Daniel knocked on my bedroom door one evening. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, a slightly forced smile on his face. Vanessa stood behind him, leaning against the doorframe, the hallway light casting a strangely calm expression across her face. "Dad," Daniel said, "we were thinking it's been a long time since the family went anywhere together." Vanessa continued smoothly, her voice light and perfectly rounded. "California. I've booked everything already. Flights, hotel, rental car. Just a short trip so you can rest." Everything had already been arranged. Too neatly arranged, I remembered asking, "Why so rushed?" Vanessa smiled. "Life is always busy. You have to go while you still can." Her eyes flicked over me quickly, as if checking something off a list. I agreed, not because I was excited, but because I wanted to understand. As a former teacher, I knew that when something feels wrong, the best approach is not immediate confrontation, but observation. That morning at Orlando International Airport, Daniel and Vanessa arrived earlier than I did. They checked in quickly, their carry-ons light and efficient. When I arrived, Daniel only said, "Go check in, Dad. We'll go ahead and save seats." I nodded, but something felt off. A family traveling together, but not together. And then this moment happened. The flight attendant, her name, I caught it briefly on her badge, was Claire, said those words. I didn't know why she chose me, a gray-haired old man among hundreds of passengers. But I knew one thing clearly. It wasn't a joke. Her hand trembled when it brushed my arm. I heard my own voice, low and hoarse. "Are you sure?" She didn't answer. She just looked at me, her eyes filled with the same expression I'd seen in people about to witness an accident they couldn't stop. Ahead of me, Daniel turned around. "Dad, what's going on?" His voice echoed through the cabin, louder than usual, edged with irritation. Vanessa turned as well, her gaze sharp, scanning me the way a doctor reads test results. In that instant, I understood I had only seconds to decide. 40 years of teaching had taught me one thing. Instinct, when sharpened by experience, rarely betrays you. I put a hand on my chest. I breathed hard. My knees buckled. I don't feel well." I heard my own voice, barely needing to act because the fear was real. Chaos followed immediately. Claire called her colleagues. A passenger stood up to offer a seat. Someone mentioned calling medical staff. I was guided out of the cabin as an announcement came over the speaker about a delay. As this happened, I looked at Daniel. His eyes met mine for a split second, not with concern, not with panic, but with disappointment. A brief, honest flash before his face rearranged itself into feigned worry. Vanessa was different. She stood up but was stopped by another flight attendant. I saw her lips press tight, her jaw clench. Then she turned away as if accepting something that could no longer be changed. I was taken to the airport's medical area. Lying on the narrow bed, listening to the wheels roll softly over the tiled floor, I knew one thing for certain. That plane would take off without me. And it did. Through the glass window, I watched it taxi, slowly, then lift off the ground. California did not wait for me. And this trip, what they called reconnecting, had never been designed for me to return. When the nurse asked if I had family traveling with me, I answered, "They already boarded." She looked at me, surprised, then offered a gentle smile. I returned it, the smile of a man beginning to understand a truth that is very hard to swallow. I closed my eyes, not to rest, but to piece everything together. The health questions, the avoiding glances, the unusual urgency, and now the whispered warning from a stranger. At this age, there aren't many things left that scare me, but there is one, being seen as a burden. And deep down, I knew I had just avoided something that was not an accident. I didn't know exactly what they had planned, but I knew that from the moment that plane left the runway, I was no longer a trusting old father. I had become a man who needed to protect his own life. And that was only the beginning. I lay on my side on the narrow bed in the airport medical room, listening to the steady hum of the air conditioner above. The fluorescent light was so white it felt cold, making everything look paler than usual. A medical staff member had just left, closing the door behind them, leaving me alone with my now stabilized heartbeat and a heavy feeling in my chest, not from my health, but from what I was beginning to understand. The door opened softly. The flight attendant from earlier stepped in. She had removed her hat, her brown hair neatly tied back, her face still tense. Her name badge read clearly, Claire Morgan. She paused near the door for a few seconds as if making sure no one followed, then walked toward me. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. I nodded. "Thank you. I think I need to know why you said that." Claire swallowed. She pulled a metal chair closer and sat down, her hands clasped together. I noticed her fingers trembling slightly, like someone trying to stay calm after crossing a professional line. "I wasn't supposed to do that," she said, "but if I hadn't, I wouldn't have been able to sleep." She lowered her voice even more, though we were alone. "Before boarding, I went into the restroom at the back of the cabin. I wasn't trying to listen, but voices carry. I recognized your daughter-in-law's voice immediately. Vanessa." The name landed between us like a weight. I didn't interrupt. I waited. She was on the phone. I didn't hear everything, just pieces, but enough to make my blood run cold. Claire took a deep breath. She talked about medication, about how the dosage would break down quickly, how at that altitude a medical episode would be easy to pass off as natural. And then she mentioned insurance. I closed my eyes for a moment, not from shock, but because every word Claire spoke fit too perfectly with fragments that had been floating in my mind for months. "Are you sure?" I asked slowly. "Could you have misheard?" Claire shook her head. "No, I've done this job for 12 years. I've overheard all kinds of conversations in airplane restrooms, arguments, breakups, things I wish I hadn't heard. But this was different. She sounded calm, like she was discussing a plan that had already been thought through. Medication, altitude, medical incident, insurance. Those 4 words spun in my head, colliding into a shape I didn't want to face but couldn't turn away from. I opened my eyes and stared at the white ceiling. Part of me wanted to deny it, to say Claire was mistaken, that my son could never. But the other part, the one shaped by nearly 70 years of observing people, stayed silent, listening, connecting. I remembered recent mornings when Vanessa made my coffee and asked, "Have you felt your heart racing lately?" Or the times she stood at my door holding my pill bottle, asking if I'd taken the right dose. She was always gentle, proper, reassuring. At the time, it made me feel safe. Now, I realized those weren't casual questions. They had a purpose. Daniel, too. My son, the boy who once held my hand crossing the street, who once called me his hero, had been asking strange questions lately. "Do you remember what day it is? Do you feel like you're forgetting things?" I had laughed it off, thinking he was worried. I never asked the question I should have. Why did he need to know? "Why are you telling me this?" I asked Claire, turning to her. "You don't know me." She was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "My father," she said, "died 3 years ago. He lived with his grandson and his wife. They said they were taking care of him. Then, one day, he fell down the stairs. An accident, they said. But before that, I'd heard conversations just like this. Medication, paperwork, insurance." She pressed her lips together. I couldn't prove anything, and I stayed silent. I regret it every day. She looked straight at me now, her eyes steady. When I heard that call, I knew I couldn't pretend I hadn't heard it. Not again. I nodded slowly. In life, there are moments when you realize you've crossed an invisible line, from innocence to awareness, from trust to clarity. This was one of those moments. "You saved me," I said, not as polite thanks, but as recognition. Claire shook her head. "I only told you what I heard. The rest is your decision." Decision. The word felt heavier than I expected. I had spent my life teaching students about responsibility and choice. I never imagined I would have to make a decision involving my own life and my own son. "I won't call the police," I said after a moment. Claire looked up, surprised. "At least, not yet." "Why?" she asked. "I need to understand everything," I replied. "If I make a scene now, they'll know I'm suspicious. And if what you heard is true, that makes them more dangerous." I reached for the jacket resting on the chair. From the inner pocket, I pulled out an old notebook, the one I'd carried since my final years of teaching. The leather cover was worn, the corners curled with age. I had always written things down, a professional habit. When you teach, you learn that memory is less reliable than paper. I opened to a blank page and began writing. Claire's name, the time, the place, the keywords she had said. I wrote slowly, carefully, as if each word anchored me against drifting. Claire stood up. "I need to get back to my shift." "But—" She took out her phone, wrote a number on the page I held out. "If you need anything, anytime." I looked at the number for a moment, then closed the notebook. "Thank you." She nodded, offered a faint smile, and left the room. I was alone again. Through the small window, I could see the runway stretching out, other planes preparing for takeoff. The world continued as usual, as if nothing had happened. Daniel and Vanessa were likely sitting on that flight, believing everything was still going according to plan. I stood up, put on my jacket, and took a deep breath. I was no longer the old father who simply nodded, but I wasn't ready to confront them either. Not yet. For now, I would stay silent. I would observe. I would write everything down, and I would forget nothing. Because if someone had already begun calculating my life as a number in an insurance policy, the most dangerous thing I could do was let them know I was aware. I left the airport as the afternoon light began to fade. The Florida sun cast a pale golden glow over the parking lot, making everything look painfully normal. People rolled suitcases, laughed, called loved ones to say they'd arrived safely. I drove home alone, the familiar route suddenly feeling longer than ever. Every turn was correct, every sign familiar, but the feeling was not. Like returning to your childhood home and realizing something has changed, even though the furniture is the same. The garage door opened slowly. I turned off the engine and sat there for a few seconds, my hands still on the steering wheel. The house in front of me, the house I'd paid off 15 years ago, stood silently. No Daniel's car, no Vanessa's gray SUV. They were still in California, believing the trip was unfolding exactly as planned. I took a breath and stepped inside. The door closed behind me with its familiar click, but the sound echoed strangely in the empty space. There was no smell of coffee Vanessa usually made in the mornings. No background noise from the television Daniel liked to leave on. Just the scent of old wood and floor polish, the smell of a house that had grown old with me. I set my keys on the table, hung up my coat, and stood still in the living room, listening. Nothing. And yet, that silence made my skin prickle. I walked slowly through each room, not looking for anyone, but reacquainting myself with the space. Everything looked the same, but upstairs I began noticing very small differences. A hallway drawer not quite closed the way I always left it. A stack of mail shifted slightly to the left when I always kept it straight. Details others might miss, but I wouldn't. I had lived here nearly 30 years. I knew where everything belonged and when it had been touched. I stopped outside my study. The door was ajar. I remembered clearly locking it before leaving for the airport that morning. I paused for a few seconds, then pushed it open. The familiar smell of old paper and ink filled the room. But something was wrong. The filing cabinet in the corner, the gray metal one I rarely opened, was closed, but the bottom drawer was slightly off. I walked over, bent down, and pulled it open. The folders were there, but not in order. I always arranged them by year, left to right. Now, 2 folders in the middle had been switched. No one does that without a reason. A chill ran down my spine. Not fear, but sudden clarity, like hearing a strange noise in the middle of the night. I pulled out a chair and sat down, opening each folder. Property documents, retirement papers, and then the life insurance folder. I hadn't opened it in years. I'd thought everything was settled, but now my hand rested on the cream-colored cover, and I knew I had to open it. I turned the pages slowly. Familiar terms, policy number, date signed. Then the beneficiary page. I read the name once, then again more slowly. Daniel Reynolds. My heart didn't race. It slowed. One beat, then another, heavy like footsteps on a wooden staircase. Before, the beneficiary had been my granddaughter in Atlanta. I had changed it years ago after my sister passed away. I remembered that afternoon clearly, sitting at this very desk, signing my name, my hand trembling slightly as I thought about her future. I had never changed it back. There was no reason to. I turned to the signature page, and that was when I knew for certain. The signature there was mine, but it wasn't mine. The handwriting imitation was fairly close, good enough to fool an administrative clerk who didn't see my signature often, but I knew it. I had signed my name thousands of times, on report cards, on recommendation letters, on every kind of document imaginable. The A in my Arthur always leaned slightly to the left. Here it stood upright. The R was stretched too long, a very human clumsiness, and also a very dangerous one. I set the paper down on the desk, both hands pressed against the cold wood. I didn't shout, I didn't curse. The feeling didn't hit like a punch. It came like cold water seeping through clothing, first a chill around the ankles, then slowly creeping up to the knees, to the chest, until you're shaking without knowing when you started. Betrayal. The word sounds dramatic, but in that moment it had no sound, no grand image. Just a thick silence, and a truth slowly taking shape. Someone had sat here, in my study, with my paperwork, and decided my future for me. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time I had opened this folder. I couldn't, and that was the frightening part. They hadn't done this yesterday, or last week. They had time to think, to prepare, to believe they wouldn't be discovered. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the room. The bookshelves, the old course materials, the student essays I'd kept because I thought there was something special about them. All of it suddenly felt like silent witnesses to a plot unfolding in the very space I had once considered the safest. Anger came late. It didn't explode. It smoldered like embers beneath ash. I thought of Daniel. Of the evenings he'd sat at dinner with me, asking a few polite questions. Of Vanessa, with her gentle voice and concerned questions about my health. Everything was suddenly cast in a different light. This was no longer a family living together out of circumstance. These were people waiting for a moment. I stood up, closed the folder, and put it back exactly where it had been. I didn't want anyone to know I had discovered this. Not yet. I locked the cabinet, then locked the study door, more carefully than usual. As the key turned, I understood something very clearly. If they dared to alter documents, they had prepared for the worst-case scenario long ago. And that scenario did not include me. I returned to the living room and sat down in the old armchair where I used to read the newspaper every morning. The daylight outside had faded. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I sat in the dark and let my thoughts settle. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't text Vanessa, and I didn't call the police. Not yet. In 40 years of teaching, I learned that when facing a major problem, the first reaction is rarely the best one. The person who shows themselves isn't always the most dangerous, and the one who stays silent and observes usually knows more than the one who speaks too soon. I stood up, went into the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. My hands had stopped shaking. In my mind, a decision was forming. Clear and cold, I would not make a scene. I would live as if I knew nothing. I would let them believe I was still the trusting old man, easy to guide. Because if this was truly a chess game, I had just seen their opening move. And from now on, I needed to watch very carefully before placing my own piece. That night, I didn't sleep. Not out of fear, but because my mind wouldn't settle. The house was so quiet I could hear the wall clock ticking in the living room, each steady beat reminding me that time was still moving, whether I was ready or not. I sat at the dining table with my old laptop, the one Daniel liked to tease me about as ancient, but which felt familiar and reliable to me. I logged into my bank account. The numbers appeared on the pale blue screen, cold and impersonal. I began downloading all the statements from the past 6 months. At first, I skimmed them and saw nothing obviously wrong. My pension still came in on schedule. Electricity, water, and home insurance bills were paid regularly. If I had just glanced through, I could have closed the laptop and convinced myself I was imagining things. But I didn't skim anymore. I printed every statement, stacking them neatly on the table. Old habits from grading hundreds of student papers each week made me distrust reading only on a screen. Paper doesn't lie. Paper forces you to look straight at it. I took a pen and marked every withdrawal. Not large amounts, nothing big enough to trigger alarms. $300 here, $450 there. Some weeks, only $120. Small numbers, scattered, like steady drops of water wearing down stone. I noted dates, locations, methods. Most were internal transfers or cash withdrawals from the same ATM less than 2 miles from my house. I added them up, one by one. When the final number appeared on the page, I stopped writing. More than $30,000 in half a year. Not money I spent. Not money I lent to anyone. And certainly not money that disappeared by mistake. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the stack of paper. The feeling wasn't shock anymore. It was like seeing the full picture after all the pieces are finally assembled, clear, cold, and leaving no room for self-deception. This wasn't impulsive theft, not something done in desperation or a moment of panic. This was a plan designed to avoid attention. Someone knew exactly how small an amount needed to be for me not to notice, how often it could repeat without the system flagging it. Someone understood my financial habits very well, knew I rarely checked statements closely because I trusted that everything was stable. I thought of Daniel. My son was not meticulous. He was impulsive, often acting before thinking. If it had been Daniel, he would have taken a large sum and then scrambled to explain it away. Daniel didn't have the patience to do this for 6 straight months, as regularly as a clock. That thought sent a chill through me. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding. If Daniel wasn't the mastermind, then who was? The answer came almost immediately, without needing to be named. Vanessa. I looked back over the statements, paying attention to the timing of the withdrawals. Most happened during the day, during my working hours when I was still teaching part-time at the community center. Vanessa worked in private healthcare administration. She was familiar with paperwork, systems, and processes most people didn't fully understand. She knew how to take side routes without leaving obvious footprints. Seemingly harmless images flooded back into my mind, so vivid they made me squint. Vanessa standing at the kitchen counter asking gently, "Have you been feeling forgetful lately?" Or smiling lightly and saying that at my age, mixing things up once in a while was normal. I had nodded, even joked back, thinking it was concern. Now I understood that each question wasn't just conversation, it was a measurement. She didn't just ask, she observed. She remembered my reactions, the way I answered, how quickly I recalled things, like someone evaluating a product before deciding to buy it. Or worse, like someone preparing a file. I remembered an evening a few months earlier. I had been looking for my reading glasses, searching the living room without finding them. Vanessa appeared, handed them to me, saying I'd left them in my study. She smiled, but her eyes lingered on me longer than necessary, as if confirming something. At the time, I'd felt slightly uncomfortable, then dismissed it. I didn't want to think badly of someone living under my roof. Now each small moment lined up in my memory, neat and terrifying. I had been observed in my own home, not for a day or a week, but for months. I had become a subject of study without ever knowing it. I folded the statements, put them into an envelope, and wrote the date in the corner. Then I placed the envelope in the deepest drawer of the kitchen cabinet, a place I knew no one would touch. I washed my hands and dried them carefully, as if trying to scrub away an invisible residue that had clung to me. I stepped out into the backyard. Dawn was approaching. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, palm trees standing still in the soft breeze. I stood there, breathing in the familiar, humid Florida air, letting my heartbeat return to normal. I didn't cry. I wasn't angry in the way movies portray it. My emotions felt like a calm lake, smooth on the surface, with a strong current underneath. I knew what I had to do next. Not call Daniel to confront him, not face Vanessa directly. Any impulsive move now would only reveal my hand. And if I had learned anything in all my years in the classroom, it was this. The winner isn't the one who speaks the loudest, but the one who waits the longest. I went back inside and made a cup of coffee. As the smell filled the kitchen, I realized my hands were completely steady. I sat down at the table, opened my old notebook, and added a new line beneath the notes from the airport medical room. Bank statements, 6 months, small, regular withdrawals, total over 30,000. I underlined it twice. Then I wrote, slowly, "Pretend I know nothing." That decision didn't come from cowardice. It came from clarity. I would continue living as if I trusted them. I would let Vanessa keep asking about my health. I would let Daniel believe I didn't pay attention to money. I would allow them to relax in the belief that their plan was unfolding smoothly. Because once you let your opponent believe they're in control, they reveal more. And I, a man who had spent his life teaching others how to analyze human behavior, would observe. I would remember. I would wait. This house had once been my safe place. Now it had become a stage, and I knew that to survive, I would have to play my role perfectly. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, not because of an alarm, but because a quiet vigilance had become part of my breathing. Morning sunlight slipped through the bedroom curtains, laying a thin stripe across the wooden floor. I lay still for a few minutes, listening to the house. No footsteps, no voices. Daniel and Vanessa hadn't returned from California yet. I had more time to prepare. When they came back 2 days later, I was ready to play my part. Daniel walked in looking tired in the familiar way of someone who had taken a long flight. Vanessa followed, pulling her suitcase, her expression composed. They asked about the canceled trip, and I told it briefly, deliberately muddled. I mixed up dates, said I didn't remember very clearly. Vanessa tilted her head, listening, her eyes lingering on me longer than usual. Daniel nodded, a mix of impatience and relief on his face. That very afternoon, I began. "Daniel," I called while he was standing in the kitchen. "What day is it today?" He turned, slightly startled, then answered. "Wednesday, Dad." I nodded. "Oh, Wednesday. I thought it was Thursday." Not a big performance, just a very small crack. In the days that followed, I scattered questions like that without pattern. I asked again about things Daniel had told me the night before. I mixed up grocery times. I stood in front of the medicine cabinet holding 2 bottles and asked Vanessa which one I took in the morning, even though I knew perfectly well. At first, they simply corrected me. Vanessa smiled lightly and said, "Don't worry, it happens to everyone." Daniel said less, but I noticed he looked at Vanessa more often. That look wasn't worry. It was confirmation, like something they had predicted. I began to forget on purpose. Not too much, not too fast. I let everything slide like a gentle slope, slow enough that anyone watching from the outside would think this was just the natural decline of age. I had taught social behavior, how people adapt to familiar patterns. I knew that if I declined too quickly, they'd be suspicious. But if it was gradual and steady, they'd take it as proof. And just as I expected, their behavior changed. Vanessa became more proactive. She stopped asking whether I needed help. She simply helped. She reorganized my medication bottles, added colored labels. In the evenings, she reminded me to take my pills before I even stood up. Her voice was still gentle, but there was a new certainty in it, like she had been granted authority. One night, I deliberately picked up the wrong bottle. Vanessa stepped in and gently took it from my hand. "Not that one, Dad. The blue one is your heart medication." I looked at her, pretending to be confused. "Really? I thought—" "It's okay," she interrupted, smiling. "I'll help you remember." I nodded, but in my mind, a word appeared clearly: control. I watched more closely after that, not with tension, but with the quiet attention of someone used to standing at the back of a classroom, watching students who think they aren't being noticed. When I forgot, Daniel often looked relieved. When Vanessa helped, she looked satisfied. There were brief, honest moments when I saw reassurance pass through their eyes, like sunlight touching the surface of a lake before vanishing. One afternoon, I heard Daniel say to Vanessa in the kitchen, his voice low enough to think I couldn't hear, "It looks like Dad's really starting now." Vanessa replied immediately without hesitation, "I told you, it was only a matter of time." I sat in the living room staring at the television, which was playing a show I wasn't watching at all. My heart beat steadily. My ears strained, but I didn't move. I didn't want them to know I'd heard. That night, I did the most important thing since this game began. I went into my study, locked the door, and took out the old medication bottles I had kept in the deepest drawer. I read the labels carefully, dosage, dates. There was nothing wrong with the medication itself, but I no longer trusted how it was being given to me. I didn't throw them away. I kept them intact. Then, I replaced the pills in my daily organizer with harmless ones, multivitamins from the pharmacy down the street, similar in shape and color. It was a small act, but as I placed each pill into its slot, my hands didn't shake. I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew why I was doing it. From that day on, I took my medication in front of them, following the schedule Vanessa set. I thanked her. I said how lucky I was to have such a caring daughter-in-law. I played the role of a man growing dependent, and I watched Vanessa relax more with each passing day. Daniel became less guarded. They began speaking more freely in front of me, forgetting that I could understand. Every night when I went to my room, I opened my old notebook. I wrote everything down: dates, times, words, actions. The way Vanessa placed her hand on my shoulder when she said, "Let me handle it." The way Daniel avoided my eyes when money came up. I wrote without emotion, just facts. The way I used to grade papers, no mercy, no speculation. Sometimes, after writing, I had to stop, set the pen down, and look at my reflection in the wooden tabletop. The man staring back looked older than I remembered. His back slightly bent, his hair much grayer. But his eyes hadn't changed. They were still the eyes of someone who had lived through war, crises, loss, and remained standing. The most painful part wasn't the betrayal. It was the change in how they looked at me. I saw clearly that in their minds, I was no longer Arthur, the father, the teacher, the man who raised Daniel. I was a number, an account, a stack of documents, an asset to be managed, controlled, and eventually transferred. One evening, as Vanessa adjusted a pillow behind my back on the sofa, she said casually, "You should rest. Let me take care of these things." "Which things?" I asked, pretending to be confused. "Money, medication, everything," she replied firmly. I nodded. "Okay, thank you." But in my mind, I thought, no, I will handle this in my own way. I kept forgetting, kept mixing things up, kept playing the confused old man they wanted to see. And the longer I acted, the clearer one cold truth became. They no longer saw me as a father. They saw me as something to be dealt with. And when people see you as property, the last thing they ever think about is family. I closed the notebook and placed it under my pillow. The bedroom light went out. In the darkness, I didn't feel afraid. I only felt that I was moving deeper into the most dangerous performance of my life. And I knew that if I didn't play my role well, the price would not be just money. The idea of installing cameras came to me on a very ordinary morning, when I was standing at the front door, keys in hand, and suddenly couldn't remember whether I had locked the door or not. I stood there longer than necessary, looked back at the lock twice, then a third time. Daniel looked up from the living room. "Did you forget, Dad?" he asked, his tone not accusing, just carrying a cold sense of confirmation. I think so, I replied deliberately slowly. My memory isn't what it used to be these days. Vanessa immediately stepped over and placed a hand on my arm, the touch just intimate enough to reassure, just firm enough to control. Maybe we should install security cameras, Dad. That way you won't have to worry. If there's footage, it's easier to check. I looked up at her, pretending to hesitate. Cameras? Wouldn't that be complicated? Not at all, she answered right away. I'll take care of everything. These days, security is very important. Daniel nodded in agreement. That's right, Dad, and it'll give you more peace of mind. I saw it clearly then. Not a second of hesitation, not a trace of suspicion. If anything, they seemed relieved, as if I had just said the very thing they had been waiting to hear. I nodded slowly, like an old man weighing something beyond his capacity. Okay, I said, install them, so I can feel at ease. Vanessa scheduled it immediately. The security company arrived faster than I expected. 2 young men in logo polo shirts came with equipment boxes and a tablet. I sat on the sofa, watching them run wires, drill into walls, and install cameras in the strategic locations Vanessa suggested. The living room, the kitchen, the downstairs hallway, the front door, the back door. Do you want one in your bedroom too? She asked very casually. I shook my head. No need. She didn't insist, but her gaze lingered for a beat, long enough for me to remember it. When the technician asked about storage options, I pretended not to understand. I'm not good with this stuff. Just set it up in whatever way is convenient. Would you like audio recording as well, sir? He asked. I hadn't even answered yet when Vanessa spoke up. Yes, definitely. Audio is even better. In case something happens to him, we'll know. I turned to her and smiled vaguely. Yeah, audio is fine too. I didn't ask any more questions. I let them think I didn't understand the difference between cameras that only record video and those that record sound as well. I let them believe I had handed over full technical control. But I knew I had chosen the right system, and I knew how to access it. On the first night after the cameras went live, I went to bed earlier than usual. I said I was tired. Vanessa brought me my medicine, watched me take it, then turned off the light. When the sound of their footsteps faded from the upstairs hallway, I opened my eyes. I didn't turn on the light. I just reached for the old phone hidden under my pillow. The screen lit up faintly. The camera app opened. I put on my headphones and adjusted the volume to the lowest setting. The living room appeared on the screen. Daniel and Vanessa were sitting at opposite ends of the sofa, the distance between them just enough for a private conversation. At first, they talked about trivial things. The trip, work, money. I almost thought I had been too suspicious. But then Vanessa lowered her voice. See? She said. I told you, he's really starting now. Daniel sighed. I know, but if it's too fast, will it be okay? Vanessa leaned forward, elbows on her knees. Fast or slow doesn't matter. What matters is whether we have enough evidence. Evidence of what? Evidence that he can no longer make decisions for himself, she replied, her voice turning cold. Confusion, forgetting things, dependence on medication, all of it can be recorded. I felt a weight settle on my chest, but my hands stayed steady. I didn't take off the headphones. Daniel was silent for a moment. I'm just afraid. What if something goes wrong? Vanessa turned to look at him. I had never seen that look before. No softness, no pretense of concern, just naked calculation. What could go wrong? Do you think if we don't do this, everything will just fix itself? I'm not saying that. You're hesitating, she cut in, and hesitation is something we don't have time for. Daniel rubbed his face, his voice dropping. So, how do we do it? Vanessa didn't answer right away. She stood up and paced a few steps across the living room, as if organizing her thoughts. Then she spoke, each word clear, no beating around the bush. We file a petition to declare him legally incapacitated. There was no euphemism, no softening of the words. My ears rang for a second, but I heard very clearly what came next. "I have a doctor I know," Vanessa said. "Not just an acquaintance, someone who owes me a favor, a few evaluations, a few notes in the right places, and that will be enough." Daniel jumped up. "Vanessa, this isn't simple. He's my father." "And you're his son," she shot back. "You have the right. The law gives you that right if you can prove he's no longer mentally sound." "But what if we're wrong?" Vanessa gave a small laugh. Not a joyful one, the laugh of someone who believes they already hold the winning hand. "Who do you think the court will believe? An old man or a young couple with medical records in hand?" Daniel sat back down. I saw his shoulders slump. "I don't want to hurt him." "No one is hurting him," Vanessa said. "We're just taking him out of the decision-making, for his own good." That phrase echoed in my ears, bitter and familiar. For his own good. I had heard it many times in my life, in the cases I taught about, in stories where the vulnerable were stripped of their rights in the name of protection. "Then what?" Daniel asked, exhausted. Vanessa returned to the sofa and sat down, her tone softening slightly. "Then everything will be simpler. Paperwork, assets, medication. We won't have to worry about him signing things randomly anymore. We won't have to worry about someone taking advantage of him." I almost smiled in the dark. Who was taking advantage of whom, I thought, but I said nothing. "You just need to be the one on paper," Vanessa continued. "I'll handle everything else." Daniel didn't answer right away. The silence stretched. I could hear the air conditioning, the clock ticking. Then, finally, Daniel said very quietly, "Okay." Just that one word. But it was like a door slamming shut inside me. The conversation ended not long after. They stood up, turned off the living room lights, and went their separate ways. I took off my headphones, laid the phone on my chest, and closed my eyes. I didn't need to hear any more. I had heard enough. They were ready to remove me from my own life through legal means. Not with violence, not with a sudden act, but with paperwork, signatures, and cold medical notes. The cleanest way, the quietest. I waited until I was sure they were asleep. Then I got up, went into my study, and locked the door. I opened my laptop and connected the small external hard drive I had kept hidden behind the bookshelf. I copied all the data from the camera system, video, audio, timestamps, dates. I named the folder clearly, without emotion. When the transfer was complete, I checked each file. The audio was clear, no distortion, no missing segments. I let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I shut down the computer and placed the hard drive into a small metal box I had once used to store my late wife's old letters. I put it somewhere only I knew, not because I was afraid they would find it, but because I understood the value of what I was holding. Back in bed, I lay there staring at the ceiling in the dark. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel explosive anger. I felt a cold clarity. The board was fully revealed, and from this moment on, I was no longer just an observer. I didn't call a lawyer that night. I let everything settle for 2 more days, like someone standing at the edge of deep water, needing to be sure they could see the bottom before stepping forward. I still ate breakfast with them, still mixed up the time, still let Vanessa remind me to take my medication. I was still the old man they believed was slowly losing his ability to decide for himself. But inside, I had shifted to a different rhythm. On Tuesday morning, I told Daniel I wanted to go to the public library near the house. "I want to reread a few old books," I said absently. "It's too noisy at home." Vanessa nodded right away. "Do you want me to go with you?" "No need," I replied. "I'll take a taxi." She didn't object. In her mind, an old, confused man going to the library couldn't possibly do anything dangerous. The taxi took me to a low building with a brown brick facade, no flashy signage. Ethan Brooks's law office was on the second floor. Not luxurious, not showy, but clean and orderly. I liked that. Ethan opened the door for me. He was about 45, dark-haired, with the calm eyes of someone used to hearing the less pleasant sides of human nature. He didn't ask many questions, just invited me to sit, poured some water, and waited. I placed my bag on the desk. Not rushed. I took out the hard drive, the notebook, a few copies of documents. I didn't tell the story at length. I told it in order. The airport, the warning, the insurance change, the bank withdrawals, the medication, the cameras, the late-night conversation. Ethan listened without interrupting. He nodded occasionally or jotted down a quick note. When I played the recording of Vanessa talking about declaring incapacity, he stopped writing. "May I be blunt?" he asked. "I came here for the truth," I said. He looked at me, his expression serious. "This is a serious case of elder abuse. There are financial elements, medical elements, and clear signs of an attempt to strip you of your legal autonomy." I didn't feel shocked, just a cold sense of confirmation. That's what I thought. "But you've done the right thing," Ethan continued. "You didn't confront them. You gathered evidence, and you came here before they filed anything." "I don't want to strike yet," I said slowly. "I want to be sure that, when I do, there's no way back for them." Ethan leaned back in his chair, thinking. "Then we shouldn't confront them directly. Not yet." He explained clearly, without complex legal jargon. If I revealed my hand too early, Daniel and Vanessa would play the victims. They would cry. They would say I was paranoid. They would use the very signs I was performing against me. And in some courtrooms, noise can overshadow truth. "We need to let them expose themselves further," Ethan said. "But in the meantime, you need protection." The plan began to take shape, step by step, unhurried. First, the bank accounts. Not freezing them outright, not triggering alarms. Ethan would file a request for asset protection under suspected abuse, but with delayed effect. When it took effect, large transactions would be blocked, but smaller ones would still go through for a while. Enough that they wouldn't notice right away, enough that they would keep doing what they were already doing. "We let them believe everything is still under control," he said. I nodded. I understood this strategy. I had taught it under other names. Patience, waiting for the opponent to make a mistake. The second step was the will. Ethan looked at me carefully as he said this. "You need a new will. Not just new, but so airtight it can't be challenged." We spent the entire afternoon discussing it. Not just how to divide assets, but how to protect my intent from future claims of undue influence. Ethan proposed multiple layers of verification, an independent notary, a cognitive capacity evaluation by a doctor, and a full video recording of the process. "I don't want Daniel to receive anything," I said. There was no anger in my voice, just deep exhaustion. "Who do you want to leave it to?" Ethan asked. "I want it transferred to an education fund," I replied immediately. "Scholarships for kids without advantages. At least, that money won't be built on betrayal." Ethan didn't look surprised. "That's a strong decision, and very hard to attack ethically." We scheduled everything for the following week, an independent medical evaluation, a private notarization, all outside Daniel and Vanessa's view. "And them?" I asked. "They're still living in my house." Ethan gave a very slight smile. "I think you should let them stay." I looked at him. You want them in my house while they're trying to remove me from my own life?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Because when people think they're winning, they get careless, and every step they take too far becomes another piece of evidence." I was silent for a moment. Then I nodded. "All right." Before I left, Ethan looked straight at me. "From now on, you're no longer just defending yourself, but remember, your counterattack must be clean, legal, and slow enough that they don't see it coming." I stood up, feeling my back straighten just a little, not because I felt younger, but because I had chosen to stand. When I returned home, I became the familiar, confused old man again. I asked Daniel what day it was. I let Vanessa organize my medication. I told an old story and forgot the ending. They watched me, and I saw confidence return to their eyes. They didn't know that while they were figuring out how to take away my rights, I had already begun taking everything back in my own way. That night, lying in bed, I thought about the word counterattack. It isn't like in the movies, not loud, not dramatic. It's more like placing a small stone in exactly the right spot on the path your opponent is walking. And then waiting. I was no longer the one being pushed. I was the one rearranging the board. And the first move had already been made. The court document arrived on a windy morning. I was sitting at the dining table, my coffee long gone cold, when Vanessa placed the envelope in front of me. She didn't speak right away. She just stood there, hands clasped together, her eyes wearing a carefully practiced look of concern. "Dad, you've got mail," she said softly, "from the court." I looked up slowly, as if it took a few seconds for the words to register. "The court?" I asked again. "Which court?" Daniel walked in from the living room. He looked at the envelope, then at me. His face was tense but not surprised. That was the moment I knew for sure. This move had been prepared for a long time. "The county court," Daniel said. "It's just procedure, Dad." I took the envelope, my hand shaking slightly, or at least appearing to. I opened it and read each line slowly, even though I already knew what it said. A petition for guardianship. Daniel's name. The reason, concerns about my cognitive ability and capacity for self-care. I looked up at them and let the confusion show on my face. "Guardianship," I repeated. "What does that mean? Did I do something wrong?" Vanessa stepped closer and placed a hand on my shoulder. "No one is saying you did anything wrong. It's just, we're worried about you. You've been forgetting a lot lately." Daniel nodded, his voice softening. "You remember last week, Dad, when you went out and forgot your phone? And the other day when you mixed up your medication?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I let just enough fear slip through. I don't know," I said. "I don't want to lose my right to decide things." "No one is taking anything away from you," Vanessa said quickly. "It's just temporary." Temporary. A word that sounds very light but can last a lifetime. The days that followed unfolded like a carefully staged play. I was called to court for a preliminary review. I went with Daniel and Vanessa. I sat quietly, head lowered, letting them speak for me. When I was asked questions, I answered hesitantly, sometimes off-topic. I saw the judge's eyes take note of every small detail, every pause, every flicker of uncertainty. Then the witnesses appeared. The neighbor across the street said she had once seen me standing in the yard at midnight, wearing a thin jacket, looking very confused. Another person said I had once asked for directions to my own house. A man I barely remembered said I often repeated the same story at neighborhood meetings. I listened, and inside me, the cold spread. I knew exactly the moments they were talking about. I remembered them clearly. That night I had gone into the yard to check the back gate after installing the cameras. At that neighborhood meeting, I had shared an old memory because someone asked about it. Nothing unusual. But retold this way, those fragments were twisted, placed into a darker, more troubling frame. I looked at Daniel. He avoided my eyes. I looked at Vanessa. She held a perfectly sorrowful expression, like a devoted daughter-in-law bearing a heavy burden. I understood the truth very clearly. They had bought off some people. Not many, just a few confirmations, a few adjusted memories, enough to paint a suspicious picture. That night, back home, I sat in my study and opened my notebook. I wrote down the names of everyone who had testified. I wrote what they had said, and then I added one more line. They don't know the whole story. Vanessa didn't let things stop there. She gently informed me that the court would require a formal psychiatric evaluation. "Just to be sure, Dad," she said. "If the results are good, everything will be fine." I nodded. "Okay, I'll go." I saw a flicker of relief in her eyes. Perhaps she believed this step would be the final period, but alongside that agreement, I activated my own plan. The next morning, I took a taxi to Ethan's office. I didn't need to say much. He understood immediately. We had prepared for this moment. "You'll attend the evaluation they arrange," Ethan said, "but before that, you need an independent assessment." We already had the doctor's name, a long-established professional with no connection to Vanessa or her network, someone known for being strict, thorough, and not easily swayed by emotional stories. The appointment took place in a quiet office that smelled of wood and old paper. The doctor asked me many questions, not questions with right or wrong answers, but questions about how I thought, how I connected ideas, how I remembered and analyzed things. I answered naturally. No acting, no trying to prove anything. I was simply myself, the person I had always been when no one stood in front of me trying to control me. He had me complete memory, reasoning, and planning tests. I worked slowly and carefully. I didn't need to appear exceptional, just honest. When it was over, the doctor set down his pen and looked at me for a long moment. "You know," he said, "I see many people your age. Very few retain this level of clarity." I didn't smile. I just nodded. A few days later, the official conclusion was sent to Ethan. I read every line. Fully lucid, no signs of cognitive decline. Fully capable of making personal and financial decisions. I folded the paper and placed it into a folder. I didn't present it yet. I waited. The evaluation arranged by Vanessa took place after that. I went and played the role of a frightened, confused old man. I gave short answers, sometimes asked questions back. I let them believe the picture they were painting was coming together. As we left the office, Vanessa smiled at me. "You did great, Dad," she said. "Now we just wait for the results." I looked at her, my eyes dull, just as they expected. "Okay," I said. "I just want everything to be calm." Inside me, something very different was growing. Not fear, not anger, but certainty. They had played their most desperate move, and I knew that when desperate people strike, they often expose their throats. I went home and sat in the room that had once been the safest place in my life. I opened a drawer, took out the independent assessment, and placed it on top of the stack of files. I didn't use it yet. Not yet. But I knew that moment was coming very soon. I didn't submit the independent evaluation right away. I let it sit quietly in the folder, like a face-down card. I continued playing the confused father, kept asking Daniel if today was a court day, kept letting Vanessa remind me to bring a jacket when I went out. They thought I was drifting along with the current they had created. They didn't know that current had already been blocked upstream. Ethan called me late one afternoon. His voice was calm, but I heard the certainty beneath it. "It's time," he said. "We file the counterclaim." The documents were submitted to the court the next morning. No noise, no press conference. Just thick stacks of paper, arranged in chronological order, each section supported by evidence, signatures, and official stamps. Ethan didn't just oppose the guardianship petition. He counterattacked comprehensively, using the very thing Daniel and Vanessa believed they controlled: paperwork. The emergency hearing was scheduled faster than I expected. When we entered the courtroom, I saw Daniel and Vanessa sitting on the opposite bench. Vanessa no longer wore her usual composure. Her hands were clenched, her eyes darting toward us again and again. Daniel stared down, shoulders rigid. Ethan stood first. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a speech. He simply said that before the court considered restricting the rights of an elderly citizen, it needed to see the entire picture. Then he submitted the evidence. The flight attendant's recording was entered into the record as the opening strike. No commentary, no long explanation, just the audio played in the courtroom. Vanessa's voice filled the space, clear, cold, mentioning medication, altitude, medical events, and insurance. No one moved. I didn't look at Daniel. I didn't need to see his face. Next came the financial transactions. Ethan presented each small, steady withdrawal, day by day, week by week, adding up to a total no one could dismiss as a mistake. He pointed out access rights, timestamps, devices used. Everything matched Daniel and Vanessa's daily routines in my house. "This is not shared household spending," Ethan said. "This is systematic withdrawal." Vanessa sprang to her feet. Her lawyer pulled her back down. I saw real panic flash in her eyes for the first time. Then came the medical records. Ethan didn't accuse. He asked questions. Why were there notes about cognitive decline that I had never been informed of? Why did a doctor's signature appear on copies not found in the official system? And why did those notes align so suspiciously with what Vanessa had said in the recordings from my home? The opposing counsel began to react. Objections, requests for delay, but everything had gone too far to stop. Daniel turned to Vanessa. I saw his lips move, but I couldn't hear what he said. Vanessa shook her head repeatedly, as if denial alone could erase what had just been exposed. The hearing ended in a heavy silence. The court did not issue a final ruling yet, but it did issue an immediate temporary order. Daniel and Vanessa's control over my finances and medical decisions was restricted pending the investigation. They could not sign on my behalf. They could not access my accounts. They could not arrange any further evaluations. As we left the courtroom, I saw Daniel standing motionless in the hallway. Vanessa grabbed his arm and said something quickly. He didn't respond. I walked past them without stopping. In the days that followed, the house changed completely. Not because it was more peaceful, but because the tension seeped into every corner. Daniel and Vanessa whispered more, stayed in their room longer. They thought I couldn't hear, but the cameras could. And at night, I reviewed everything, a habit now stripped of emotion. They began deleting data. I saw Vanessa sitting at the laptop, deleting folders, emptying the trash. Daniel carried out a large paper bag, stuffing it with documents from my study, then tearing them up. At one point, the shredder jammed. Vanessa snapped, yanked it, then ripped papers by hand. All of it was recorded, not just video but audio, rushed voices, accusations whispered back and forth. I told you to be careful. I thought everything was fine. What do we do now? I didn't intervene. I didn't walk in. I let them reveal more. Ethan had warned me. The more panicked they became, the more mistakes they would make. One evening, Daniel knocked on my bedroom door. He stood there, eyes red, voice shaking. "Dad, we need to talk." I looked at him slowly, as if it took a long time to think. "Talk about what?" He swallowed. "About what's been happening. There's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," I repeated, my voice hollow. I don't really remember anymore. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. I saw real desperation. But I didn't open the door. Not because I was cruel, but because I understood. At this point, any softness would be used as a weapon against me. The next morning, Ethan called. "The court has received additional material," he said. "What they're doing at the house, we have it." I stood by the window, looking out at the garden I had once tended tree by tree. "Is it enough?" I asked. "Enough to take away their initiative," Ethan replied, "and enough to protect you." I hung up and returned to the dining table. Daniel and Vanessa were sitting there, silent. No one spoke. The air was heavy, like the moment before a storm. For the first time since everything began, I felt the shift clearly. Not in me, but in them. They were no longer setting the pace. They were reacting, putting out fires, defending. I took a sip of coffee, calm. Inside me, a quiet certainty spread. The truth had been dragged into the light. And when the light shines, there is no shadow deep enough to hide. I knew that from this moment on they had lost control of the story, and I had taken back the right to decide my own life. The trial date arrived faster than I expected. A gray morning, drizzle like dust, not heavy enough to soak clothes but enough to make you feel cold. I sat at the dining table, looking at the calendar on the wall. The date circled in blue ink, Ethan's handwriting. I had looked at it many times that week, but that morning I finally felt its weight. Daniel and Vanessa didn't speak during breakfast. They ate quickly, avoided my eyes. The house was so quiet I could hear the spoon touching the plate. I didn't ask anything. I didn't mention the court. Words were unnecessary now. Outside the courthouse there were more people than I expected. Not a noisy crowd, but enough to make it clear that this story had moved beyond the walls of my home. A few reporters stood near the steps, notebooks in hand, cameras hanging from their necks. I overheard my name mentioned. Elderly father, guardianship dispute, suspected abuse. The phrases sounded distant, as if they were talking about someone else. Ethan walked beside me, his steps slow and steady. "You don't need to look at them," he said quietly. "Just look straight ahead." I nodded. I didn't feel afraid, just tired. But it was the kind of tiredness that comes after a long journey, when you know you're on the right path, even if it hasn't been easy. The courtroom was brightly lit, a solemn space, wooden benches lined in order. I sat in the front row beside Ethan. Daniel and Vanessa sat across from us. Vanessa wore a dark suit, her makeup carefully done, but it couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes. Daniel looked as if he had aged years in just a few weeks. His shoulders sagged, his hands clasped together, restless. The judge entered the courtroom. Everyone stood. I stood slowly but steadily. When I sat back down, I placed my hands on my knees, feeling the cool surface of the wood through the fabric of my pants. I told myself, just tell the truth. The trial began with Ethan's presentation. He didn't attack. He reconstructed the story in chronological order. From the canceled trip at the airport, to the discovery of altered documents, to the financial transactions, to the attempt to obtain guardianship. Every detail was placed where it belonged. No embellishment, no emotion. Then the key witness was called. The flight attendant walked into the courtroom with a slightly stiff posture, but her eyes were steady. I recognized her immediately, even though we had only met once. When she took the oath, her voice trembled briefly, then steadied. She recounted exactly what she had overheard in the airplane restroom. No speculation, no exaggeration, just cold statements about medication, altitude, and the possibility of a medical event. When the recording was played, the courtroom fell completely silent. I didn't turn to look at Daniel and Vanessa. I didn't need to see their reactions to know the impact of those words. No one spoke for several seconds after the audio ended. That silence said more than any defense ever could. The opposing attorney tried to probe, to find cracks. They asked about mishearing, about context, about personal motive, but the flight attendant answered directly without evasion. She said she didn't know who I was. She didn't know my family. She only knew that if she stayed silent, someone might never get the chance to step off that plane. Next came the experts. A handwriting analyst presented their conclusion. The signatures on the insurance documents and power of attorney did not match my genuine signature. Not just in shape, but in rhythm, pen pressure, and habitual pauses, details that a non-expert could never perfectly imitate. The financial records were projected onto the screen. Rows of numbers scrolled by, steady and cold. Small amounts, day after day. A chart appeared, combining everything into a total that caused murmurs around the room. I looked at that number not with anger, but with a quiet sadness. Not because of the money, but because of the persistence it took to do that. How deliberate did someone have to be to withdraw small amounts so regularly while still sitting across from me at the dinner table every night? Then it was my turn. Ethan stood and turned to me. "Are you ready?" I stood up. I didn't need to take a deep breath. I had been preparing for this moment for a long time. I stepped to the stand, placed my hand on the Bible, and took the oath. When I turned to face the courtroom, I saw many eyes on me. Not pity, not curiosity, just waiting. "I'm not here to accuse my son," I began calmly. "I'm here to tell what happened." I told it from the beginning. No rambling, no unnecessary detail. I spoke about living together, about questions of concern that slowly became excessive, about the feeling of being watched, about discovering altered documents. I spoke about my decision to pretend to grow weaker, not to deceive anyone, but to protect myself. I didn't cry. I wasn't angry. I didn't use the word betrayal. I simply said that at my age, the most frightening thing isn't death. It's being stripped of the right to decide your own life while you're still clear enough to understand exactly what's being taken from you. When the opposing attorney asked if I still loved my son, I answered honestly, "Yes, but love doesn't mean closing your eyes." The final question was what I wanted from the court. I thought for a second. "I only want the truth to be seen where it belongs," I said, "and I want to live the rest of my life without pretending to be someone else." I returned to my seat. My heart beat steadily. Not fast, not slow. The jury withdrew to deliberate. The wait wasn't long, but it was heavy enough for everyone in the courtroom to feel it. I stared straight ahead, saying nothing. Ethan sat beside me in silence. When the jury returned, I knew the outcome before they spoke. Not because I guessed, but because throughout the trial there hadn't been a single gap large enough for doubt to take root. The verdict was read, point by point, clear, decisive. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not to hold back tears, but to memorize the feeling of truth, slow as it may be, finally being called by its proper name. When I opened my eyes, I didn't look toward Daniel and Vanessa. I looked at the flag hanging behind the judge. I thought about the years I had spent teaching, believing in the value of truth even when it was inconvenient. The trial ended. Everyone stood. I stood slowly but firmly. I knew that from this moment on there was no longer any way around it. This was the trial that couldn't be avoided, and it had unfolded exactly the way truth always does, quietly, but impossibly to deny. The sentence wasn't issued that same day. The court needed time to finalize the process, but the outcome was already clear to everyone. I returned home that afternoon to the familiar house, but the feeling was different. There was no longer a tension waiting to snap. Just a quiet emptiness, like after a storm has passed, leaving broken branches and cool, damp ground behind. A week later, the official decision was issued. Daniel and Vanessa were convicted of elder abuse, financial fraud, and document forgery. Not in angry language, but in the dry wording of the law. And it was that dryness that made it undeniable. Ethan called me that morning. "The court has issued the final ruling," he said. "Their inheritance rights have been permanently revoked." I was silent for a few seconds, not from surprise, but because somewhere very deep inside me there still existed the image of a boy named Daniel, who once held my hand crossing the street, who once sat on my shoulders during Independence Day parades. Inheritance revoked meant that door had closed completely. "The court also issued a no-contact order," Ethan continued. "They are not allowed to approach you, call you, text you, or contact you through a third party." "I understand," I said. After I hung up, I sat quietly in the living room for a long time. The midday sunlight came through the window, casting the wooden frame's shadows across the floor. I thought about the years when Daniel was small, when this room was full of laughter, not with regret, just with acknowledgement that everything has an ending, even the things we once believed could never be broken. The news spread faster than I expected, not because I wanted it to, but because cases like this always draw attention. The media no longer called Daniel a concerned son caring for his elderly father. They used different words, more direct, colder. Vanessa lost her job in the medical field just days after the ruling was announced. There was no need for a long meeting. It was enough to confirm that she had abused her professional knowledge and connections for personal gain. Doors that had once opened easily for her closed so quickly that I knew there would be nights she couldn't sleep, nights she had once slept soundly in my house. Daniel faced another kind of collapse. His gambling debts, long hidden, surfaced when the court demanded financial transparency. The amount wasn't small. This wasn't a few casual games. It was a long chain of bad decisions, covered up with other people's money. With my money. Ethan didn't say much about that. He only said one sentence. "Everything they tried to hide is finding its own way into the light." I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel relieved in the sense of victory. I felt a cold balance being restored, like a clock that had been running wrong for years finally being set correctly, even if the ticking now sounded more bare. That evening, I sat at my desk. In front of me was a blank sheet of paper. I knew what I needed to do, not because the law required it, but because I needed to close this chapter in my own way. I wrote Daniel a letter. Not long, not ornate. I didn't mention money. I didn't mention the court. I didn't mention Vanessa. I wrote as a father writing to his son one last time, knowing that from now on, that relationship would no longer exist in its old form. I wrote that I had once been proud of him, that I had trusted him more than anyone else, and that because of that trust, the pain wasn't in the money that was taken, but in the choice he had made. I wrote that I held no resentment. I meant it honestly. Resentment requires energy, and I no longer wanted to spend energy on what was already dead. I wrote that I forgave him in the sense that I would no longer carry anger. But forgiveness doesn't mean continuation. Some boundaries, once crossed, cannot be redrawn. I ended the letter with a single short sentence. From today on, each of us walks our own path. I read the letter once more. Then I folded it and placed it in an envelope. I didn't mail it myself. I gave it to Ethan and asked him to forward it through Daniel's attorney, properly at the distance the no-contact order required. When the envelope left my hands, I didn't feel loss. I felt a door closing decisively, without the need to look back. In the days that followed, the house slowly became quiet in a different way. Not the quiet of suppressed tension, but the quiet of a space returned to its true owner. I moved through the house without listening for footsteps. I drank my coffee without watching who was looking. I slept deeply, without dreaming of recordings or altered documents. One morning I stood in the yard trimming bushes that had gone untended for a long time. My hands were slower than before, but steady, each cut deliberate. I realized that through all of this, I hadn't just been fighting to keep my assets or my rights. I had been fighting to keep myself. The father-son relationship, as I once understood it, had officially ended. Not with a loud explosion, but with a series of small choices that accumulated until there was no way back. I straightened my back and took a deep breath. There was no one behind me anymore. No one I had to pretend to be weak for. Just me, my old age, and the part of life I still had the right to decide. The price of greed had finally been paid, not through revenge, but by each person facing the consequences of their own choices. And I knew that for me, this chapter was closed. No lingering anguish, no unanswered questions. Just a quiet space, enough for me to move forward. After everything, I returned to living alone in the old house. No suitcases rolling across the floor at midnight, no whispers behind half-closed doors, no watchful eyes every time I picked up my phone or opened a folder. The house returned to its natural rhythm, slow, steady, and quiet. In the mornings, sunlight streamed through the living room windows just as it had for years, landing on the armchair where I used to read the newspaper. In the evenings, the wind moving through the garden trees was so clear that I realized I had forgotten that sound for a long time. Living alone at this age isn't easy, but it isn't as frightening as many people think. The most frightening thing isn't loneliness. It's living in your own home while constantly being guarded, suspicious, and pretending to be weak just to survive. When that ended, I finally understood what it meant to breathe freely. A few months later, I began volunteering as a teacher at a community center near my home. Not academic lectures, not a heavy schedule. Just a few sessions each week, sitting with young people growing up in a world far more chaotic than the one I knew. I talked to them about history, about how people repeat mistakes when they stop asking questions, when they hand over control without keeping clarity for themselves. I didn't tell my story as a bitter warning. I told it as a lesson in attention, in noticing small things. I told them that knowledge doesn't live only in books, but in the ability to recognize what is normal and what has been twisted under the disguise of "for your own good." Those classes didn't make me younger, but they made me feel useful, and at this age, that is a great gift. Through everything that happened, I came to understand one truth very clearly. Knowledge and clarity are the strongest weapons a person can carry to the very end of life. Not physical strength, not money, but the ability to understand what's happening around you and not allow others to define reality for you. Old age does not mean you must be controlled. It only means you need to be more careful, slower, and hold on to your right to decide a little longer. Slowness, when paired with clarity, is not a weakness, it's an advantage. And family, this I learned in the most painful way, does not justify betrayal in the name of care. Real concern does not require control. Real love does not require taking away someone else's rights. Any relationship that demands you pretend to be weaker in order to be protected is not protection. I also want to be clear about one thing. The story you've just heard is a created story meant to reflect very real issues many older people face: financial abuse, loss of decision-making rights, manipulation under the guise of family. It is not meant to spread hatred or attack any individual, profession, or organization. It is told to remind, to open conversation, and to help those in vulnerable situations understand that they are not alone, and that they have the right to protect themselves through knowledge and clarity. If this story made you pause, even for a moment, then for me, it has fulfilled its purpose. I sit at my desk, once my trench, during the most tense months of my life. Now there are no legal files or backup drives on the surface, just a few books, a new notebook, and a quiet afternoon moving slowly past. I take a sip of tea, look out at the garden, and for the first time in a long while, I don't need to be on guard. Life didn't let me choose how it began, but it gave me the right to choose how to close a chapter, with calm, not bitterness. And if you stayed with me all the way to the end, I am truly grateful. Thank you for listening to this story until the final moment. Where are you watching this story from? If you were in my place, do you think you would choose silence, confrontation, or a different path? I would truly like to read your thoughts in the comments, not to judge right or wrong, but to share perspectives. If this story gave you something worth reflecting on, please like, subscribe, and continue along with us so that the next stories can still reach those who need to hear them most. Once again, thank you for your time and for listening with respect.